Point Blank is a crime fiction podcast. It may not be suitable for all listeners. We discuss violence in all its forms. The works we reference may include period slang, which some listeners may find offensive.
Episode 31, No Country for Old Men by Cormac McCarthy. Well, howdy, partner, as we... I can't even...
Well,
howdy, partner.
Well,
Welcome to Point Blank. Justin and I are...
well, shucks. Guys,
Oh, shucks.
good to hang out with you, partner.
Welcome to the Hootenanny. Oh, yes. Woo. We are here once again for Point Blank, the crime fiction podcast. We're discussing No Country for Old Men today, the work of Cormac McCarthy. Are you excited to discuss this one, Justin?
I think I am. I've read this book enough times, and I've seen the film enough times. I've kept the film at arm's length for a while now. I can't wait to watch it tonight after we finish this podcast. I'm going to enjoy it and see how it differs from this book, because there are some differences, and I'm sure we'll speak to those a little bit today in our deep discussion of the book. How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm excited to talk about this one. I mean, we've discussed on previous episodes how much we both love Cormac McCarthy's work, and my experience to McCarthy, I have you to thank for that, because you sent me Blood Meridian years ago on when I was on a boat, and I will admit the first time I read it I had a little bit of trouble with it, but McCarthy's work has grown on me so much, and I just love what he does, and I'm excited to see it here in No Country for Old Men, a book I did thoroughly enjoy.
I'm still very delighted that you received a book from me via boat mail, because it's such a foreign concept to me. I've never been on a boat long enough to get mail, so I'm glad that worked out, and I'm especially glad that it led us so many years ago from there out on Lake Michigan to here discussing this particular book, which is not Blood Meridian. It's sort of like a Blood Meridian cleaned up, streamlined, and made a little more palatable for a general audience. Both are of great value, I believe, but this one I think is easier fodder for discussion for a general audience. I'm sure that you think similarly.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I mean, this is one of McCarthy's most accessible works, and I think once you've read this book, I think it would be easier to read one of his other books, just because, and we'll get to this in his style, but I mean, just the idea that, he doesn't use quotation marks for dialogue, for example, can make it difficult.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, it can make it difficult. And
he does have some idiosyncratic formal stylings that he's been pretty stubborn about, but he's consistent.
Yes,
from the start of his literary career. I'm actually reading his first novel now, The Orchard. Is it The Orchard Keeper?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I started that a couple nights ago, and it came out in 1965, and even this was back when he's in his more Southern Gothic phase. He's still consistent with the lack of quotations and typical English grammatical punctuation. He had no interest in it. He's not into semicolons. He's made this very clear on numerous occasions, and while a lesser author might get poo-pooed for their stubbornness in this regard, Cormac sort of gets a pass. Maybe because he's a famous white dude, maybe because he writes really well. But yeah, this is a good gateway novel for him, and even more some of his themes about morality and life and ethics, and some of his deeper Old Testament biblical.
Oh, yes.
There are these pieces of his writing that crop up over and over again. They're here in this book, but to a lesser extent than they are in, for example, Blood Meridian. And some of his diction is a little more streamlined here too. We're looking more Hemingway here than we are Faulkner.
I would agree, and I think it's easy to call his writing Hemingway-esque, or probably more accurately Faulkner-esque, but it is something else of its own entirely. And as you brought up, here we have another old white dude, American author, but I mean, I think in this case, he deserves the accolades that he gets, and this writing is so evocative. It's so Old Testament biblical power, and just the way that he uses language, violence, the natural world, all of these things intertwined. It's powerful writing, and I think anyone who has even read a sample of his work is going to see that.
Why don't I dive right in here and offer my longer review of this piece, and then we can get into our discussion. Sounds good?
Great. Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so No Country for Old Men. It was written by Cormac McCarthy and published by Knopf in 2005. It's a wickedly beautiful neo-noir western set in southwest Texas around 1980. Pre-cell phones, noted. There are three major characters. The first is Ed Tom Bell. He's a small-town Texas sheriff. He serves as our narrator and, to some extent, our moral compass. Or does he? The question's out. I think he does. We'll talk about it. The second is Llewellyn Moss. He's a 9-to-5 working-class welder. He's an ex-Vietnam vet. He lives in a trailer with his young wife, Carla Jean. Out hunting one afternoon, he stumbles across a bloody, botched drug deal on the U.S.-Mexico border and finds a satchel full of money. He takes the money. This sets the plot into motion, and the whole story stems from that. The third main character is hitman Anton Chigurh, who's one of the scariest, if not the scariest villain ever put to print. We might argue, some will, and some will fight, that Judge Holden, the character in Blood Meridian who serves as the ultimate villain, is the scariest or scarier than Chigurh, but there's something grounded and rooted in real life about Chigurh that makes him more frightening to me. He gets wind of the missing money, and he seeks to get it back. For whom, it's unclear. He sort of acts like a lone wolf. It doesn't really matter, not to us as readers. Every time he's on the page, my shoulders tense and my hair bristles. He's a frightening guy, and we'll talk plenty about him, I'm sure. So, the story starts with the money missing. Moss takes the satchel, brings it back to his trailer, but there's a problem, and the problem is his conscience. Out there on the plain, he left one man alive in the aftermath of the shootout. The man asked Moss for water. Moss didn't have water, and he left. In the middle of the night, lying in bed, he struggles over this decision, and he decides to go back into the desert to bring a gallon of water to this guy. Of course, this is a bad move, brings him back into the scene of a crime. This is great for us as readers because now we get trouble, and plenty of it. He has $2.4 million on him, or at least holed up in his trailer, and he runs back after being hunted down by some dudes who see him out there trying to give water to the dying man, and he barely escapes with his life. He recognizes very quickly that he's in a shitstorm of trouble, and he goes on the run. He leaves Carla behind, tells her to go to her mother's to get away from this situation. He knows that these people are onto him. And turns out that the people that are onto him are on all sides. We have the Mexican cartel men who sold the drugs. We have the American financiers who bought the drugs. And then we have Anton Chigurh. So there is a body count, and the violence starts quick and fiercely. In one camp, we have Moss, who serves as sort of the American optimist and exceptionalist. He's not a brilliant thinker, he's not a mastermind, but he has a good heart, and he thinks that his way is going to work. And then we have him fighting against this sort of oppressive Old Testament force of chance and chaos and war, which is Anton Chigurh. It's a really interesting, climatic, tense struggle between these two different ways of thinking, and you really start to get into some of McCarthy's philosophy, a little bit at least, in this story. We have Chigurh. He tells Moss that he eventually, when they finally meet up, a bunch of other stuff happens that I'm not going to discuss. We'll save that for the later discussion. Chigurh tells Moss that he cannot save his own life. He's doomed no matter what happens. They're on the phone talking to each other. But he can spare his wife, Carla Jean. And Moss, Mr. Tough Guy, he refuses the deal. He says he's going to make a special project out of Chigurh. He has no idea what he's getting himself into. He tells Carla Jean, you better get out of where you are and go to El Paso with your mother. He's trying to protect his partner, his wife, while also playing this tough guy against the forces of evil bit. And he has no idea how it's going to turn out, but you get a sense in the story that this is a noir, and it's not going to end very well. At the end, and this is a spoiler, Moss gets killed in a shootout, not actually by Chigurh, but by another one of the operatives, because he let slip. He spoke to somebody on the phone, and it triggered, somebody was listening in, essentially. And so there were too many moving parts, and Moss wasn't prepared to handle all the moving parts. We have this third character I barely mentioned. We have Bell, sort of serves as this moral compass. He has these sort of intertwining italicized narratives talking about his experiences as a sheriff in this county. Back in the old days when things were simpler, now things are more complicated with the border wars and the drugs and the increasing violence. And he tries to paint this picture of things being worse than they used to be. Of course, this is a myth and it's not exactly accurate, and we start to see that over the course of the story. Anyway, he took it on his own person to protect Moss and Carla Jean. He took it personally that they were in trouble because he wanted to save these genuine, decent county citizens, so to speak. He arrives on the scene in Van Horn and finds out that Moss is dead, and this has a major effect on him. He loses this commitment he had made to protect Moss. He finds a vent in the air duct removed and finds that the money is gone. He knows that this guy Shagor, who he's been aware of, is out there, this ultimate evil. And rather than stick around and face him, he gets out of there. We realize that Bell just doesn't have it in him to continue on in this facade as sheriff. He can't face what's coming. He can't deal with the problems of the modern era. So we flash forward a bit. Carla Jean returns from her mother's funeral. Moss is dead, her husband. Her mother's dead. She finds Shagor sitting in her house waiting for her. He makes her flip a coin, which is a major symbol in this story, and we'll talk about that. And she calls him out, and she's the first character to do so, saying that this coin did not choose whether or not she dies or lives. It's him, and she puts it back in his court. She dies. He kills her. Back to Bell. Bell retires. He can't hack the life as a sheriff anymore. And the story ends with two, and this isn't incomplete. I'm trying to hit on the big beats, but not tell all the story. The story ends with two Bell dream narratives. He's telling his wife in retirement. The first is his father gives him some money and he loses it. That's a minor dream. The second is this dream, and I'm going to read it because I think it's beautiful, and I think that it sums up a lot of the aspects of this book and film. We was both back in older times, and I was on horseback going through the mountains of a night, going through the pass in the mountains. It was cold, and there was snow on the ground, and he rode past me and kept on going. Never said nothing. He's talking about his father. He just rode on past, and he had this blanket wrapped around him, and he had his head down, and when he rode past, I seen he was carrying fire and a horn, the way people used to do, and I could see the horn from the light inside of it, about the color of the moon. And in the dream, I knew that he was going on ahead and that he was fixing to make a fire somewhere out there in all that dark and all that cold. And I knew that whenever I got there, he would be there. And then I woke up. And that's the end of the book. All this spells out a terrific tale of violence and philosophical pondering about the way the world is and the way it was and the way it will be. Not McCarthy's best novel, but it doesn't have to be a great book. Not only is this a great book, it was made into an even greater film, I think, by the Coen brothers, who did wonders with the script, cinematography, and the casting. I give it 5 hits, hands down. I think it's great. What do you think, Kurt?
Well, as I mentioned last episode, McCarthy's a 5-star author for me. This is a 4-star book, a very strong 4-star book. Maybe I would say 4.5, but I want to stick with the 4 just to kind of differentiate it a little bit here. I think it's a great book. I think there's so many good pieces of dialogue. There's so many good scenes in this. There's a couple of things that as a reader just drop it off for me a little bit. One of the things, and you mentioned this in your summary, is that Moss dies off the page. I didn't like that. I didn't feel that that was a fitting way for this character who we spent a fair amount of time with to go. I felt that his death needed to be on the page, and that's kind of why this drops off for me. That's the biggest reason. I can kind of see why McCarthy did that, but I just have a problem with it. Overall, this novel has so much to say when you read between the lines, and you alluded to a lot of this is, there's generational issues here. There's different ways of looking at violence through the different characters. But yes, especially Anton Chigurh is perhaps one of the most, perhaps one of the most iconic villains in this type of fiction that we've had in the 20th century. And, some of that is helped by the casting of the film, which was done so excellently, but just a creepy character and someone whose outlook on violence is unsettling. Unsettling even in a way that the best, I don't know, serial killer novels don't necessarily accomplish. It's very unsettling to think about this character. And especially because this is definitely more of a noir ending than it is a standard detective fiction ending, and that he's still out there at the end of this novel. There's no resolution to that violence. He gets away with it all, and that leaves us wondering what was the point of all of this, in a sense. And then that's part of the point, and that's what the book is about, an exploration of violence.
You say it, Shagur's still out there, and Shagur is an embodiment of deep evil and more a symbol or an idea than an actual man, though he clearly is that too. A man is he haunting when he's on the page or on the screen. We should talk about characters now. Obviously, we're going to talk about Anton. Do we want to start by focusing on him, or are there other characters here that you're compelled to speak to? We have Ed Tom Bell, the sheriff. We have Llewellyn. We have his partner, Carla Jean, who I think is an interesting character, though she's not on the page very often. A guy I did not mention is Carson Wells. He's like a clear-headed hitman who's sent in to find and I guess liquidate Anton Chigurh. He doesn't last very long, but he's an interesting piece of the puzzle, and I wonder why he was sent in. Then there's Bell's wife and Bell's uncle. That's really it. It's a small cast of characters. They all play significant roles. Of these characters, are there any in particular that really stand out to you or speak to you?
At the end of the day, as you said, they all are there for a reason, which we've talked about in previous episodes. That's not always the case with authors, but in this case, McCarthy is using these characters who reoccur for a reason, and I think, going back to my point about this exploration of violence, we have different perspectives on how violence is expressed. I find Sheriff Bell to be, of our secondary cast of characters, I think Anton Chigurh is essentially our main character here. Even if he's not necessarily our point of view character, he's still the focus of the thing. But for me, Sheriff Bell and these chapters in the book, which are basically Bell's reminiscences or his thoughts as things go on, I think Bell is probably the most interesting secondary character, simply because he has what I think the average reader is going to see as the most logical approach to the violence that occurs on the page.
He's the narrator for a reason. His boots are on the ground. He's been around for a while, and he has a clear-headed... He's not actually very involved in the plot itself. He observes, and yes, he speaks to his observations, but he's not stealing money. He doesn't actually solve the crime, really.
No.
He's always showing up a half a step late. He doesn't have the pacing necessary to confront the modern criminal world that he's experiencing in 1980 in Texas. So he's a great character for seeing how things are and reflecting on it, but not a great character if you want a riveting protagonist, which is why you suggest that he's not really, he's not that. That's more... Moss is more a fatalistic protagonist, and you speak to his death being maybe a little disappointing. We'll talk about that in a bit. Did you like Ed Tom Bell? Do you think that Cormac McCarthy used this character appropriately for the purposes of this novel?
I would say so, because I think he's using it again as a perspective on violence. And you mentioned this sort of false notion of the past, of this it wasn't violent before, and now this is like some new version of this extreme violence occurring because of the drug trade and whatnot. Well, Sheriff Bell is only really referring to a fairly brief period in history of, let's say, mid-20th century Mexican-American border relations or whatever. And we only need to look at McCarthy's own writing to set Blood Meridian, for example, to see that the violence has been worse in the past.
Yes, totally. I thought about that the whole time I was reading. I'm like, if somebody might read Ed Tom Bell as being like this sort of reactionary conservative figure, like, oh, back in my day, everything was great. Let's make America great again. But if you know anything about McCarthy's work and his analysis of the West, like you understand that this stuff is cyclical and that this violence is deep and human and not really a product of any particular moment. And like you say, Ed Tom Bell is talking about and reflecting on it. Back in my grandfather's days, he was a great man, and he had these rose-tinted spectacles looking back on Grandpa, who he only knows through a very narrow prism of understanding. But Grandpa was around in the post-frontier days, in the post-settlement days, right? After all the great violence and the great bloodshed and warfare that happened over American expansion and conquest. And he was there when things finally got settled and things were calm for a while. And now things are blowing up again because that's the way of the world.
And historically, that can actually even be true because his grandfather, given that this is Bell is towards, what is he, like in his late 50s, 60s or something at the time of this novel?
In 1980, yeah.
So his grandfather would have been around during the Mexican Revolution, and there would have been a lot of violence very close to the border at that time.
Yeah, Pancho Villa invaded Columbus, New Mexico in 1916 or whatever. So yeah, it wasn't like things were calm. Maybe in their particular county, but even that is very limited frame of reference. And what facts does Ed Tom have? He has memories, he has stories, and all of our reflections on memory are limited in scope. We tend to crop out the shit that we don't want to remember, and we focus on the little moments of joy and positivity, and we paint our history that way. Humans have a tendency to do that.
And Bell is definitely giving us that perspective. And when we look at these other characters, and I'm leaving Carla Jean out of this conversation for the moment because she's kind of her own unique perspective in this. But when we look at Moss is and McCarthy doesn't get into this too much, but he definitely suggests that Moss, who is a veteran of Vietnam, has been dealing with the effects of the war that he witnessed, and that has something to do with his perspective on this whole thing and his competence as far as when it comes to the weapons that he's using and his feeling that he's going to come out of this okay because he's been through Vietnam. I mean, what's a couple of guys running drugs going to do to him? So we have his perspective on violence. Then we also have Carson Wells, who you mentioned, he's the former Special Forces guy who's now a professional hitman. He personifies that trope of crime fiction of the hitman who is the gangster professional. The guy who's thinking about it. He's like, well, yes, he kills people, but he kind of keeps it within the trade. Like you're going to get killed because you double-crossed your crime boss. And for the most part, a lot of people feel that, like, okay, well, I get that. That's part of your creed. And then we have Anton Chigurh, who doesn't care about anybody and will kill at the flip of a coin.
Yeah, I mean, Carson Wells, his code is rooted in the profession, whereas Chigurh's code is rooted in something he's manufactured, which is uncertain to us and mysterious. He operates on a whole nother platform that's out of our reach of understanding or comprehension. His understanding of the world and his code is almost like some weird Lovecraftian plane outside of our comprehension. We never quite tap into who he is because he's barely human. He doesn't operate within the constraints and confinements of human emotion or human understanding or empathy. He's somewhere else, and that's what makes him more frightening. But that's also what makes Carson Wells more understandable and more relatable. Sure. He's a likable guy, and in the film, he's played by Woody Harrelson, who generally comes across as a likable guy, an understandable human. So we get that contrast between him as a hitman and Chigurh, and perhaps that's why he was planted in the story, Carson Wells, to show the contrast and to show just how far removed Chigurh is from all of these human affairs.
There is a little bit of interesting broadcasting in this as far as, this is taking place in the 80s. It was written in 2005-ish.
Yeah.
It predates most of the extreme violence in the cartel wars and whatnot on the border, even in the writing of it, but Bell sort of predicts that. But Chigurh sort of is a stand-in for that New, I hesitate to say new, but I think you understand what I'm saying here. Is this increase in the violence, and we could say that's a return to the violence of an earlier period, perhaps.
Perhaps it's different players and it's a different
Yeah.
circumstance. It's the narco wars of the early 21st century, which is different from the Revolutionary Wars and the border wars between the U.S. and Mexico. Different players, but the same. It isn't like this kind of violence is surprising or new to human experience. Yeah.
I think ultimately, and again, McCarthy is an author. He doesn't say a lot about what he's writing. He writes it and lets it stand there for your interpretation. For me, as a reader, these characters, especially these male characters in this story, are standing there as representations of different perspectives on violence.
Totally. And we have Ed Tom Bell. He has the old way and the conservative, patriot, traditionalist understanding of America, quote unquote. We have Anton Chigurh, who's like this different scale, almost like a geologic scale or a human history scale, deep understanding of violence, almost like animal or earthly violence, the kind that goes back eons. He has a cosmic understanding of violence. Llewellyn Moss he's more like a recent phenomenon. He's sort of a creature from the 70s, the Vietnam vet, working class Joe, struggling to get by. He's cocky. He's American. He has a skill set and he knows it. He's not arrogant. He's cocky though. He's confident that he is capable enough of whatever is before him, which is sort of the American dream, in its essence, this notion that we can do anything if we put our mind to it. He takes that viewpoint and tries to live by it with this finding of the money and surviving these hitmen. And obviously he fails. He gets in over his head. You can't change what's coming, is what Bell's uncle says later on. And Moss is a victim of this. What did you think about Moss? I think he's an interesting character because, like you said, he dies off the page. We're with him. Is he the moral center of the story, or is he the guy that we're supposed to be rooting for or not?
I think so, and that's why I have a problem with him dying off the page, because I think we're supposed to see Bell as being a little bit like behind the times, I think we're supposed to see that he hasn't caught up with what's going on in the modern world, and Moss has done that a little bit. If we'd ended the book with Moss's death, I guess I would almost feel more comfortable with that. But we actually have, not a substantial amount of the book, but maybe 10 or 20% of the book left at the time that Moss dies. And I think that is the character we're supposed to connect with the most. But again, maybe that's because that's the character who's potentially the closest in age to the average person reading this. I don't know.
I think that it was an interesting move on McCarthy's part to kill Moss early. And upon rereading the book recently, I was surprised to find out how early it is in the book that Moss's narrative ends. Like you said, I think it's more like 20% of the book we have at the end, where it's just Bell and whatever happens with Chigurh and Carla Jean. It's not a denouement. It's a large chunk of the book still happening, which makes me question whether or not Moss is the central narrative, and maybe what the central narrative is more the idea of violence and change, and Bell versus Chigurh, these two supposedly opposing viewpoints on an era and on violence and human affairs. It was weird, and I admit that. And I think if I didn't love the way it ends so much on its own with Bell, I would be a little bit concerned by that. And I think it is a flaw in the book, perhaps, that Moss dies so early on and so unceremoniously, removed from the centers of everything, the focus of the story. And with the runaway...
Yeah, let's talk about her.
The runaway woman in the novel. She's in the film as well for a very short time, and nothing much happens. And I mean, nothing really happens with her and him in the novel itself either, but they take up a good chunk of time talking about life.
Yeah.
And what was her function? Why is she in that story? Is she a stand-in for Carla, or does she offer some other thing in the story that we need to hear as readers?
Yeah, it is a really interesting conversation, and you're right. It takes up quite a number of pages, this relatively
bit character.
Yeah, the fact that she also is killed at the same time. Is she ever actually named in this? I don't believe so.
I don't believe so either. I don't think so.
It's certainly not enough to be memorable, but Moss and her have this, extended conversation where they're kind of going back and forth about why is she hitchhiking and what is he up to. And he says, well, he basically tells her, well, I'm a crook, I'm a safe cracker. And she's like, well, she says that doesn't bother her. She's trying to get to California.
He's like a little cocky with her.
Yeah.
He's a little bit show-offy. He's like, he pulls the gun out from under the seat. Mm-hmm. I think he's enjoying his 15 minutes of fame as this badass with her.
Yes.
But in reality, he can't hack it in the real world, but he creates that image, that false image in the minds of a young traveling person that he's really almost superhuman badass dudes wandering the frontier or something.
It is a little weird, and you want to, if we're supposed to relate to Moss, it's a little bit odd that he knows at some level the level of danger that he's in. So why would he bring this young girl? I mean, she's 15 into this, and there is an element of Moss which is. He's definitely trying to impress this girl. If you could relate that to actually him hitting on her, I don't know. But she's 15. We have to remember that Moss's wife is like
19.
Yeah, he's 36 and she's 19.
He likes younger gals. That's clearly established.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, he does not hook up with this runaway gal. Like, we get a sense of his character. We get a sense of who he is. He's sort of this fallible, dumb luck dude. He's not some superhero. He's not some heroic figure. I mean, Cormac doesn't paint characters that are that clean. He's ambiguous. He's a little bit dopey. He tries to be one thing, but he's not. But he also isn't going to cross that line, at least with this gal, and compromise his relationship integrity. So we get a sense of who he is and who he isn't. And then in the end, essentially, they die together. I think it really is because Carla Jean makes a mistake.
Yes.
She's talking to Belle on the phone.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of a push and pull throughout the narrative of Belle reaching out to Carla saying, hey, I'm concerned about your husband. And she says, essentially, she's like, I'm not going to fucking talk to the cops and reveal, her loyalty is with Moss. But over the course of the story, as things get worse and worse, she realizes that, well, Moss is in over his head, and this Belle doesn't seem to be like such a bad guy. She, makes him promise that he's not out to get Moss, that he's not pulling a fast one on her. And then when she feels comfortable with Belle, she tells him, she says, okay, Moss needs help. He's over here in Van Horn at this hotel, this or that. As we learn in the novel, that conversation is being recorded, I think, by the Mexican cartel, some dudes in that cartel, and they then send out their assassin hit squad to take him out. Of course, she doesn't know that happens. Nobody knows the consequences of their actions, but we as readers see all these consequences.
Yeah.
There's so many people, and there's really no way out.
Yeah, and Carla, let's talk about Carla Jean for just a minute, because she is a good character, although she really doesn't occupy that much of the page.
No.
And, that's a criticism of McCarthy. He does not write many female characters.
No.
And Oprah Winfrey, in her interview, called him out on that. I think his reaction to that is a little bit weak. I mean, he basically says, well, women are tough. I don't understand women. Well, that's a real lazy cop-out. Like, writing anybody who is not yourself is tough. Put in the work. That's part of being doing anything, but particularly being a writer.
I agree.
But I mean, I think for when she is on the page, Carla Jean is interesting.
His conversation with Oprah sort of showed why he doesn't talk to folks often. He's a smart dude, but he might not have that kind of keen, critical self-analysis that makes for interesting conversation. I don't know.
Well, that's an interesting point because, we're all speculating here because he doesn't sit down and say, well, this is how I write. He's obviously gifted. He's obviously someone who, maybe gets, maybe rightfully gets the label of genius, but I'm struck with what I read and researched of his process is how much does he actually know of what it is he's doing? Or is he just somehow just very good at this? And he can't articulate why he's good at it. I don't know.
We can't know, and it's okay, but I'm not one to assume that just because somebody is reclusive and coy means that there's some kind of genius. No, that's not it. They could be anything. They could be anywhere on the spectrum. The reality is we don't know. But Carla Jean is a strong character, I think, and for the amount of space she's given, which is limited, she does some good. I think she does some good stuff with it. She pushes Moss a bit. She challenges Moss a bit. He's on his own path, and she can't help that. But ultimately, her confrontation with Anton Chigurh at the end of the story is awesome.
Yes,
I think
yes.
she pushes back at him and makes us see him for who he is, a monster, and not some kind of cosmic being who knows everything, but a fraud who gets off on killing and violence in the way that he does.
Yeah. No, very much. She does. You're totally right that she exposes him and that he's definitely like operating under, and we've used this language before, but under this sort of Old Testament idea that he's like somehow providing judgment to people. They die because it's their time or some nonsense of that sort. And you're correct that she's saying, nope, you're the one who pulls the trigger. You're the one who makes this decision.
And I'm sure that Cormac wasn't trying to make he's not some kind of social justice dude, but I feel like she's just indicting him. She's just saying, fuck your patriarch. You just concocted a bunch of bullshit to justify your actions, and I'm calling you on that. And she dies, and Anton moves on because that's the way the power exists in this world. But it very much, I feel like that's the bright light in the story. And I feel in a lot of ways, arguably, that's like the central moment. That's like the key climax, because there is no climax with Moss. He dies off the page, like you said. Bell retires, and Anton Chigurh doesn't get caught. It's her confrontation with him.
I would agree.
In that upstairs bedroom when like everything gets illuminated for one brief moment.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. As we bring this conversation on this book to, trying to wrap it up here, are there any other themes that you would like to explore?
Yeah. In terms of plot and theme and stuff, this is a streamlined book, and we said that he wrote this initially as a screenplay, I believe, and it feels like it. The prose is tight and more Hemingway than Faulkner. We got a very clear Western borderland setting. We get some of Cormac's philosophy, his interest in violence, morality, and the human condition, but it's a little less dense or mucky or swampy or rich. It's much more dried out, sort of like a beef jerky version of his meaty philosophical meanderings. We get a terrific villain in this novel. We get an interesting setup because we have the three main characters interweaving, but the guy that we expect to have the classic narrative ending doesn't have that for us. He dies before you'd expect him to, and he dies in an unceremonious fashion. So I guess my thoughts on this are that it's an interesting structure, especially for a Cormac McCarthy novel. I think he has a very bleak view of the world and I get behind that generally. I like the way that he explores human experience, and I really love how this book handles the history of the U.S. border with Mexico before the ultra violence, as you said, of the Juarez cartels and all the shit that went down with Juarez, with the femicides and the ultra violence in 2009, 2008, when the killings were like 2,500 people a year. Charles Bowden, who's a nonfiction writer who passed away a few years ago, he really wrote some real terrific work on the violence of the drug war in the Juarez area and explores just the conditions that led to that violence, including nation-state conflict and trade and all these very modern globalist issues that have affected and led to this recurrence of violence, which isn't new. It's sort of a product of vast structural changes in the wake of the defeat of the USSR and the rise of global capitalism and all that stuff. Anyway, this story precedes that, but like you said, it alludes to it, and we know what's coming. And it's very prescient because Cormac couldn't have known the future, but he saw the tendency and he saw the threads and he saw what was coming, and he painted a pretty interesting picture of the prequel to that violence. I think this is a really fun, powerful, interesting, bleak read. We actually talked less about Anton Chigurh than I expected. I could probably just talk about him for hours. He's just such a scary dude. In the book, he's a blue-eyed dude, and in the film, they got Javier Bardem to play him, and now he has the iconic role with that page boy haircut and those brooding dark eyes and that deep guttural baritone. He's taken that role and it's become him. So when I reread the book and I'm like, this like tall, blue-eyed dude, it was jarring. I had to think about him in this fashion. I tried to create a new character that still had that kind of cosmic, wicked integrity. And I could do it, but it's different now that having seen Javier pretty much perfect that role.
There's two elements of this that I wanted to bring up. The first is more something to think about. McCarthy has been known to say that he doesn't like the idea of magical realism in a lot of Central American and Mexican fiction, which is just a quote from Out of the Thing. But that said, I think it's really odd that he says that, and yet there is almost a I don't want to say magical element to his writing, but there is these, like, again, I hate to overuse the idea of biblical, but there is a superstition or a folktale element to some of his writing, and I think you see that in the character of Judge Holden in Blood Meridian, and you also see that here with the foreshadowing, particularly when Carson Wells sees that the calendar has been hit with a bullet 3 days in the future. And that ends up being the day that Carson Wells dies. So just something to think about there is how McCarthy brings in this old school way of adding a superstition or magic to a tale.
This might not be the word you're looking for, but when you say superstition, I think myth. I think he's really into mythic themes.
Yes.
Stuff that's it's not supernatural, but it has such deep roots and it's obscured in the history of time, and maybe things reoccur and patterns happen. I think they are rooted in folk tale, and they are rooted in myth, and the Bible is mythic. And this stuff is a thread throughout all of his work. But yeah, in the midst of all this real clear-headed realism, you can't deny the fact that at its heart, most of Cormac's work is wrapped up in mythic tales of human experience.
Yes. And the other interesting thing, and I want to leave on this, is you mentioned his bleak vision of the world. And I think, and this is something I don't normally notice in a book, but my copy of No Country for Old Men is the Vintage International Edition. And when you flip it over to the back side where there would normally be the portrait of an author, we have a photograph of Cormac. And it's a very evocative picture. At first, I wasn't taken by it, but the more I thought about it, the more I thought that, wow, this is really quite the portrait. And let me just describe it for you. We're looking at Cormac's study, his library. He is sitting on a couch. The center of the photograph is a bright lamp, and he is off to the viewer's left. He's tilted away from the light. His head is down and his eyes are closed. It's almost as if he is put off by the light. Like, it's painful to be under the light of that lampshade.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it's really evocative, and it could be, this could be a little bit pretentious or whatever, this picture, but it is odd to see an author photograph which actually expresses some of the author's vision that comes through in his work. And for that, I will continue to read Cormac McCarthy for his bleak biblical Old Testament look at the world and the beautiful fiction that he creates.
I'd like to conclude by reading a couple verses from Sailing to Byzantium by William Butler Yeats. This is the poem from which Cormac McCarthy got the name for the book. The first verse is this: "That is no country for old men, the young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations at their song, the salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas, fish, flesh, or fowl, commend all summer long whatever is begotten, born, and dies, caught in that sensual music, all neglect, monuments of unaging intellect." Verse 2, "An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick, unless soul clap its hands and sing, and louder sing, for every tatter in its mortal dress, nor is there singing school but studying monuments of its own magnificence, and therefore I have sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium." There's more, but I'll stop there. It's cool to see the roots of some of these stories and story titles. So let's wrap up there and move on to Dog-Eared Classic, and then we have Cinema Spotlight before we conclude.
Yeah, let's go review some stuff. And now it's time for Well-Thumbed Classics, and this time around I'm going to be looking at a book called Black Wings Has My Angel. This is by Elliott Chaze. It was originally published in 1953 from Gold Medal Books. I looked at a edition from the New York Review of Classics from 2016. This one was also published as One for My Money or One for the Money. So if you're looking for the book, you can find it under any of those titles. Critic Ed Gorman said of this book, "Many people feel this is the single best novel Gold Medal published during its heyday." And I can see where some people would say that. This was a pretty solid novel. Black Wings follows Tim Sunblade, an escapee from prison, as he teams up with a mysterious working girl named Virginia. While in prison, Tim was told of the perfect crime by one of his cellmates or other, is in prison with this guy, Jeppy. And he kills himself at the beginning of the novel in something of a spectacular fashion as he jumps off of a wall. But during this time, that's when Tim is able to escape from prison. Now, the problem with this plan that Tim wants to put into action is that it requires two people. So when Tim meets Virginia, he first has to decide if she's going to be up to the job. Well, as we might expect, he does decide that she's going to work out for this job, and they head off to Colorado to try to rob an armored car. Now, along the way, their lives become more and more intertwined and more complicated. And as with most great noir stories, it's not so much the crime that moves the story, but the fallout. And this one is no different. And it really delivers on that as the tension between this relationship between Tim and Virginia goes hot and cold, back and forth throughout the planning of the robbery, during the robbery, and the aftermath of the robbery. It is the heart of this story is their love-hate relationship. And it heats up even more once they have that money in hand. Now, the writing in this is tight and engaging. I enjoyed how the storyline was broken down into the different acts. I felt it worked for this book. Sometimes that doesn't always work in fiction. It feels forced, but for this, I felt it worked. The crime felt just unique enough to be interesting, yet be believable. The only thing I'm a little tired with from some of the crime fiction I keep reading in this era is the trope of how quick the main characters fall in love or have this romantic interest in one another. And I guess that can be expected just to speed the plot along, but it does feel a little bit forced. This was really Elliott Chaze's one and only hit. Now, he wrote 10 novels overall. 5 of them are considered crime fiction, but this is the one where he really hit it out of the park. Otherwise, he spent his life as a journalist. He lived from 1915 to 1990. He served in World War II right at the end, and he would become a journalist out of that, working for the AP in both New Orleans and Denver. And both of those locations show up believably in this novel. So it's clear that Chaze had some experience with those locations. And then he went on to work for most of his career as a journalist in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. As I said, he wrote 10 novels, 5 of which could be considered crime fiction, and this is really the cream of the crop when you look at Elliott Chaze. Bill Pronzini said of this book, "Black Wings Has My Angel is a book that must be experienced, not read quickly for casual entertainment. It makes demands of the reader, as any piece of quality fiction does, and those demands deliver hammer blows where other noir novels provide light raps." And I would generally agree with that. I think this book stands the test of time for those reasons. I think this is one that you would really enjoy reading, and I would recommend Black Wings Has My Angel. So, Justin, other than my issue with them falling in love quickly, I really think that this is a solid piece of noir fiction and worth all of your time.
Well, I have a new feature for us this episode. It's called Cinema Spotlight. I'm taking a noir film that I've watched recently and discussed it. with you all. And I'm now a subscriber to the Criterion channel, so I figured I'm going to make the most of that and turn it into some good fodder for Point Blank. The film I saw this episode is called Branded to Kill, and it's a Japanese new wave crime film that came out in 1967. It's evocative, it's challenging, and you can tell that it's of the time, but it also stands alone as a unique piece of art. It was directed by Seijun Suzuki, and it stars Joe Shishido, Koji Nambara, and Anu Mari. The story follows a contract killer who works for the Yakuza and entails a love story that becomes a double cross. Though the film has gained a reputation in recent years and is preserved by Janus Films as significant, it did pretty poorly at the box office and actually got the director Suzuki blacklisted from the Japanese film industry for 10 years. Though that in itself turned him into an icon, it didn't actually bode well for him at the time. The main character is Goro Hanada, and he's played by Joe Shishido, and he's the number 3 killer in a group of mafiosos competing for the number 1 spot. He has a fetish for the smell of boiling rice, and you see this numerous times in the film, which I can understand. Boiled rice, it smells delicious. After a freak occurrence causes him to miss a target, he becomes a target himself. He gets with Masako Nakajo, a femme fatale played by Anu Mari, who enlists him in a murder, but she also falls in love with him, of course. Her first line is, "I hate men, my dream is to die," which was reminiscent of Gloria from They Shoot Horses, Don't They? There's a lot of stylistic pop arty stuff in this film, a lot of real cool scenes. There's a man on fire running across a field. Tons of sex, a surprising amount of sex for a Japanese film, at least in my experience. A lot of thematic dead birds and butterflies, a black and white hipster sheen, a jazz soundtrack, tons of violence, melancholy, disaffection. This is a film that reeks of style and clearly nods its head toward the noir crime films of the 40s. Film director Jim Jarmusch called it probably the strangest and most perverse hitman story in cinema. So there's that. I also see how this film could have inspired Quentin Tarantino. One of the music tracks on the soundtrack is called Scotch and Hard-Boiled Rice, which I thought was appropriate. And a fun fact, the film was edited in a single day because the director simply didn't have the time. So, all that makes up for a pretty interesting film. I highly recommend it if you want to see a singular entry into the world of film noir. I give it a definite hit. It might be over the top, it might be off the rails for some folks, but definitely singular.
That sounds pretty good, Justin. What was the title again?
It's called Branded to Kill.
Branded to Kill. 5-round burst. 5-round burst is when we do 5 reviews in, well, as short a time as possible. First up, I've got The Ways of Wolf. It says right here on the cover, a border noir. This is by James Carlos Blake. Came out in 2017 from Mysterious Press. This is part of a series, which for some reason I didn't realize when I started reading it, but it does stand alone. They all cover the Wolf family, which has operations on both sides of the border. In this one, we follow Axel Prince Wolf, who 20 years ago teamed up with his friend to pull off a rather poorly thought out robbery. He ends up in prison. And before that happens, he's left behind a daughter, Jessie, who hasn't seen since. And his partner / friend in the robbery, Billy, double-crossed him. Now, with the help of a young inmate by the name of Chacho, he's escaped jail and with the goal of seeing his daughter and perhaps getting revenge. Now, this isn't bad. It mostly follows the escape, and I sort of expected the book to get beyond that, but no, most of it is the escape, which takes place along the border. And I did feel that the book was missing a little bit of depth, and that's probably because I wasn't aware of the rest of this Wolf family series. And so maybe I would have gotten a little bit more out of that. But overall, I would still call this a hit. It's a little bit more of a slap in the face rather than an all-out prison brawl.
All right. So my first entry is Paco Ignacio Taibo II's book, Some Clouds. This was originally published in Spanish in 1985 and translated to English by William Newman and published in the U.S. by Penguin in 92. It's number 3 in Taibo's acclaimed Private Eye series featuring Detective Hector Belascoran Shane as he scours the streets of Mexico City on a case that involves murder, the mob, and millions of missing pesos. It might be my infatuation with Mexico City, but I love this book. Taibo's detective is an interesting, memorable character, and the supporting cast, including the rat, the traumatized and quick-witted Anita, and the ex-wrestler bodyguards willing to learn canasta. Taibo exposes us to the bustling city life, to the corruption of Mexico and Mexico City, to the political unrest that's a product and part of his political views that he experienced as a student activist during the student movements of the 60s in Mexico City. All of this leads to what I would say is not exactly a straight PI story. It pushes the genre into new territory, with Paco Taibo making a metafictional appearance in the tale, sort of like Vonnegut does, as a writer, character who becomes a target for the mafia in the book. He spends time as a character with the PI, Hector Shane, and has an interesting role. It's fun to see that kind of play with his series. I like how the story flows from violence to light conversation and soda pop drinking to meditations on corruption. I like the short chapters and the play with form. I also like the ending, which is a quieter, more thoughtful ending than I expect from the genre. Definitely a hit for me, and I look forward to spending more time with Taibo when we visit Mexico on the last stop of our global tour of noir later this year.
Yeah, that sounds good. I'm looking forward to reading him as well. Next up, I've got Nightland. I'm reading the 2001 edition of this. This is by an author, Lewis Owens, who actually taught at University of New Mexico there for a while, Justin. This is published by University of Oklahoma Press, and Owens is was of Choctaw, Cherokee, and Irish descent. And much of his fiction centers on this idea of mixed heritage and the conflict that comes from belonging to different cultures. And he tends to throw that in with a mix of crime fiction. And this one is no different from that example. I think it's beautifully told. It's seemingly a mixture of the styles of Irish, Native American, and American storytelling. In this one, we get the story of two guys, Will and Billy. They're both half Cherokee ranchers in New Mexico. And at the beginning of this book, they find a corpse and a lot of money. And of course, that can't go well, even though they feel that this money could solve a lot of the problems that they've been experiencing. And that's really at the heart of this story. But not only that, Owens blends in some of the spiritualism, the mysticism of Native American culture into this story as well. And I think he does that very beautifully. And the story sort of has this chain reaction of much like, say, a wildfire spreading across the prairie, where a small spark starts a whole chain of events that really decimate both Will and Billy. Now, this one was good enough to me that before I even finished this, I ordered another book by Owens. This is an author I would like to cover in a future episode, so I don't want to give too much of this book away, but Nightland is highly recommended. I think Owens is an excellent author and covers some very conflicted but dark and wonderful territory all at the same time.
My second entry is Gabino Iglesias' second novel, Coyote Songs, published in 2018 by Broken River Books of El Paso. This book is a tautly crafted meditation on violence and revenge in border country. The story is set in an unnamed place along the Texas-Mexico border and features a cast of characters who tell the story through interweaving narratives. The novel starts with Pedrito in the back of a truck with his father mere moments before something terrible happens. We move on to the mother, as she keeps watch over her boy and anticipates a supernatural arrival. From the mother, we meet the coyote, who is tasked with roughing up 4 migrant children to give them a fighting chance. Later, we meet Jaime, Alma, and La Bruja and get a sense of how their stories come together. I didn't love every narrative thread in the novel, but most of them were strong and left a powerful after image. There's terrific dialogue, wicked, hard-boiled violence, and some truly stomach-turning scenes of suffering. Nothing gratuitous. The story has heart, and that's what makes the violence all the more palpable and disturbing. Half hard-boiled noir, half supernatural horror, Coyote Songs looks at how imbalances of power, mixed with plenty of desperation, can really mess up not only individuals but entire communities. But there's also old magic in the story that serves as a counter-narrative to the violence and helplessness. The darkness consumes, but might it also cure? A slap to the face with a buffalo carp.
All right. For my last review, I've got actually another one from Gabino Iglesias. This is Zero Saints, which came out in 2015, also from Broken River Books. This one covers the main character is Fernando, who is a dealer and muscle for the Zeta cartel operating in Texas. Early on in the book, he's abducted by a rival cartel who wants him to pass along a message to his boss. And to make sure he gets the message, they've already kidnapped his friend Nestor. When he shows up at a house, Nestor is tied up, and to express the seriousness of the situation to Fernando, they proceed to cut off his fingers, throw them into a bucket where a mysterious critter eats them, and then, finally they cut off Nestor's head. So this leaves Fernando after revenge, and after he talks to his boss, who's really a bit incompetent and not grasping the seriousness of the situation, he goes on this plan to avenge his friend Nestor. And pulled into this story is a Russian hitman, a former Puerto Rican pop sensation turned hitman, and also a strong dose of spiritual power from a Santeria priestess. Does that sound right, Justin?
Santeria, yeah.
Yeah, from a Santeria priestess. And again, interesting that you mentioned this in your review, but again, we have a level of mysticism or the supernatural from this saint worship that we find in elements of that religion. And that is a strong element in Zero Saints as well. Now, I enjoyed this story. I did feel that it was a little bit short. It's a scant 170 pages or so. I would have liked more from this one. However, it was an enjoyable read. The only problem, and this is only a problem of my own ignorance, is that there is a lot of it written in Spanish. And for me, it was hard to stay with the narrative and also be looking up what the phrases were in Spanish. It's definitely a book where you're going to get a little bit more out of it if you're at least slightly more bilingual than I am. But like a votive candle to the head, this one is a hit.
The Gabino Iglesias 2-for-1 here.
Yes.
Coming up in future episodes, as we stated in the previous episode, we're beginning our international literary road trip, starting with episode 32. We spend time with Jean-Claude Izzo's Total Chaos, which takes place in Marseille, France, and the greater Mediterranean. After episode 32-33, we move on to Lagos, Nigeria, where we spend time with Oyinkan Braithwaite's My Sister, the Serial Killer. I'm looking forward to reading that one and into exploring a new geographical region of noir fiction. Down the road, we will be heading to Japan, to Brazil, and ending up in Mexico City to conclude our literary road trip, which should last the majority of the year. How do folks contact us, Captain Kurt?
Well, hopefully they already have their passports in hand because we're already at the border check. To contact us, if you have any problems with the border, we'll be of no help. But you can find us on Facebook at Point Blank Hardboiled Noir and Detective Fiction. You can send us an email at pointblanknoir@gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter at Point Blank Noir. If you're looking for other ways to interact with the show, you can always go to Goodreads and find the Point Blank Readers Group there. And if you're feeling extremely generous and you would like to back the show, you can go to Patreon and give us a couple bucks on Patreon. Also, we would really appreciate it if you could give us a review on iTunes. Those do help. We haven't had one in a while. If you like the show, go ahead and give us a nice review on iTunes. Otherwise, we will see you next time on the sunny shores of the Mediterranean. Hopefully, you've packed your bag. Perhaps you've smuggled a handgun, because we will be covering Mediterranean noir.
See you then.
Adios.
Point Blank is under a Creative Commons license. Music is by Justin. Copywritten works are property of their respective holders.